This is Locked On Sports Atlanta, and it's time for the Atlanta Football Party, only on Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Atlanta Football Party. I'm your host, Jarvis Davis, and riding with me today, I have Aaron Freeman, who's the host of Locked On Falcons, and I have Tori McElhaney, who is the senior writer for AtlantaFalcons.com, sitting on this live edition of the Atlanta Football Party. I want to start off by saying thank you for making the Atlanta Football Party your first listener today, and we're free and available wherever you download your podcast, and wherever you download your podcast, make sure that you leave us a 5-star review. Really appreciate that from you in advance. The Atlanta Football Party is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I also want to remind you that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. And coming up on today's show, how clear is Terry Fontenot's vision? And the Bengals and Trey Hendrickson are at a standstill. Is it time for Terry to start warming up the oven? But first, we have to talk about, we've talked about a lot on this podcast, Tori, about Kyle Pitts being a potential trade asset. And I think as free agency has kind of moved on, I feel it's, we're about a month away from the draft right now. I feel like this is something that probably need to have a conversation about. So for you, and this, as I was thinking about this, I feel like when it comes down to whether you should trade a player or not, you have to ask yourself, is he more valuable on my team, or does what he bring in return deem more valuable given the situation that you're in from a roster building standpoint? So where do you kind of sit as to whether or not Kyle Pitts should be traded, and what type of value does he bring, and is he worth keeping on the roster for 1 year with potentially not re-signing him in 26?
I think that I would love to know how robust the market really is for someone like Kyle Pitts, which I know that's the number one question, right?
Absolutely.
It's like, you have to weigh how robust the market is, how much is our teams calling for him, how much would a team like, I don't know, the Indianapolis Colts, to just throw somebody out there that need kind of this like offensive weapon, tight end type of guy. How much would a team like that be willing to play ball with the Falcons to get someone like Kyle Pitts on their roster when they're actually in a really good space to be able to get one of the best, if not the best, tight ends in the draft come the end of April? Sure. Like, that's currently the conversation I think like that's being had, is what is Kyle Pitts' value for the Falcons, and what is Kyle Pitts' value for the team? I think at this point in time right now, I actually see that the Falcons are probably valuing him higher than maybe what teams across the league are. And because of that, I think that's why you would probably more than likely see that he will finish out his 5th-year option with the Falcons and then go from there, and using kind of this like final year to really decide, okay, what type of market is Kyle Pitts going to draw in free agency next year? That's where I kind of land on it. I just don't necessarily think at this point in time that the market for Kyle Pitts warrants what the Falcons would be willing to kind of like play ball with a little bit when comparing him to not being on the roster.
Yeah, I'm with you. That whole, like, having a partner to dance with matters, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and if someone wants a guy like that, or if someone sees value in someone like that, they have to determine whether or not, hey, this is this day 2 pick. I'm cool. The player that I'm going to bring in with this day 2 pick is not going to be worth more than bringing a guy like Kyle Pitts in. So I know, Free, for you had some questions as far as Zach Robinson, and I think this is the important part of the conversation too. Zach Robinson, as far as using Kyle Pitts and what that feels like. A lot of Falcons fans like, oh my God, you need to use Kyle Pitts more and all that stuff. But for you, do you feel like that should be a determining factor as to how Zach Robinson is going to use Kyle Pitts going for this 1 year versus thinking about whether or not he's a fit for this offensive scheme and try to see if there's some value out there as far as on draft night specifically?
Well, I had a Locked On Falcons listener at the beginning of about a month ago basically break it down, I thought, pretty succinctly, where it's just like with Kyle Pitts, it's either use him or move him. If you're not going to necessarily use him, then that value that we're talking about that he has for this football team is, not very much. But I do feel like when you look at the market, like a month ago, I probably would have said, oh, the trade market for Kyle Pitts will be robust. But then, Denver kind of was able to pick up Evan Ingram. That was one of those teams that was looking for a tight end. You heard rumors around the combine about Michael Mayer being on the trade block. Now there are rumors about Dallas Goedert being on the trade block. And so I think the market has kind of been flooded with alternative options at that tight end position. And so Kyle Pitts sort of standing sort of alone looks a lot better when he's sort of alone as a potential option for some of these other teams, as opposed to 1 out of 4 or 5 options in addition to the options that teams have in the draft. So I do feel like the potential upside of trading Kyle Pitts is a lot less now than it was maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago. But I do feel like if the Falcons obviously should be able to answer their phones, if a phone call should come on draft night or whatever on Thursday night or Friday night, and a team, the board didn't fall the way that they wanted it to fall with their tight end that they were targeting in round 1 or round 2 or round 3. And then, if one of those teams says, hey, what's going on with Kyle Pitts, are you up, that sort of thing with Terry Fontenot? Then I do think the Falcons can sort of answer those calls and sort of gauge it then. But I do feel like right now, when you look at where the market is with the available options for the Falcons or for other teams at the tight end position, probably the value of Kyle Pitts to this team right now, given they're putting a lot of hopes into their offense to kind of carry this team this year, that potential upside of, even if Zach Robinson isn't going to necessarily feature Kyle Pitts as much as he does like Drake London and Bijan Robinson and Darnell Mooney, like just a sprinkling, if you can get a sprinkling of Kyle Pitts plays like we saw in October, where it's like you can get 1 or 2 plays a game from Kyle Pitts, I do think that's going to do potentially wonders for this offense, whether it's the explosive plays, whether it's getting him more involved in the red zone or whatnot. Like those are going to be sort of valuable to this offense to help not only raise the floor, but also the ceiling for this offense this upcoming season. So I do think his value to the Falcons right now, as things sit here right now, is more than his value would be to other NFL teams.
And so let me ask you this. So, given how you just laid it out, and he's on this roster in 2025, the reasoning for the Falcons not signing him back, do you think it will be just for overall scheme fit or from simply just not being productive?
I think probably, obviously we got to see how this season plays out, but
sure,
it would probably be the production, right? It would probably be that you have 5 years or, potentially 5 years of, a body of work for Kyle Pitts. And, one of those years was outstanding. We'll see what this upcoming season brings. But the other 3 years were a little underwhelming based off of the expectations for him. And not all of that were circumstances that he could control. Some of that's quarterback play, some of that's injuries, all that stuff. We've talked about a bunch over the last 4 years with Kyle Pitts. But I think ultimately, when you're looking at why we're going to pay Kyle Pitts the type of money that I'm sure Kyle Pitts wants to get paid on his next contract, I don't think you can, unless he's going to be one of your top 2 options this upcoming season, it's going to be hard to justify paying him a lucrative second contract that's going to make everybody happy based off of the production that you've seen so far. So I do think production is more of the issue than necessarily a scheme fit. But, I'm sure you can have scheme fit conversations with the type of tight end that this offense seems to want. That may not necessarily be the type of tight end that Kyle Pitts is, but I think ultimately it's going to be more production based.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, because I think that towards the end of the season, we start to see a lot more Charlie Warner, in these particular situations. And I think that being able to the enjoyment that Charlie gets blocking and how good he is at it, I think he's more of a fit. I mean, I know people may look at me like I'm crazy, but that's just what it is. I like what this offense looks like with Charlie Warner at the tight end spot, because they want to be able to match people, and that, to be honest with you, that's their strong suit, and turning around handing the ball off to Bijan Robinson is a really good idea. And they figured out how to do it on a really strong basis in which they needed to. And the offensive line stepped up this year for those guys to be out there, to go out there and be productive in the run game. So I think that ultimately, Kyle, the production, it has to be there for them to consider bringing him back. And I almost kind of looked at it when we were having a conversation about Caleb McGarry earlier on in the offseason. Just, it seems like it would be a contract like that if he were to come back, like everybody sit up there and look at the contract and say, oh, that's not too bad. And if he has a super productive year, but I don't foresee that happening. But I think this is an interesting situation where you have a guy who has all the measurables, 6'6", 247, and he had a decent year last year, with not being like the number one option in this offense. And you are in a situation where, like, okay, we like Charlie Warner better because he's a better fit. That would be very interesting. But Tori, for you, if we had this conversation about, him potentially more than likely being on this roster in 25, do you see, if he doesn't come back in 26, do you see it being a production issue or a scheme fit issue?
I mean, I'm with Bree about it being production. I think that you can insert Kyle Pitts, the talent and the body type and kind of his ceiling into any offense, and an offensive coordinator would be like, hey, there's a lot of potential here. Sure. The problem has never been the potential of Kyle Pitts. The problem has been the production or lack thereof. And I think that I go back and forth as to whether or not, like, how much that had to do with the quarterbacks in place in Atlanta. But then the argument that I even give myself is that, well, production has been there for someone like Drake London, and regardless of who was throwing the ball his way. Absolutely. And so I think that ultimately it does boil down to production or lack thereof. And I think that's something that Terry Fontenot even said at his end of year presser when he was asked about Kyle Pitts. He's like, Kyle wants more. We want more from Kyle. Everyone's on the same page as to like what needs to happen with Kyle Pitts and his overall production. And yes, like, there is this argument when you have so many offensive weapons, like, not everyone is going to have their moment to shine. But to your point about, like, if you can get 2 or 3 big moments from Kyle Pitts a game consistently, and he doesn't kind of just like fall away and you don't really hear from him, or you have the drops or the misses or whatever the case may be, if he's having these like big moments in a game, you'll take that every single day. You'll take 2 or 3 big time plays from Kyle Pitts, whether they be first downs or whether they be explosives. You will take that in year 5 and be, I think, pretty excited about what you're getting from him, comparatively speaking to how much of the pie is going to Bijan, Tyler, Drake, Darnell, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, it always has boiled down to production. That's always been the conversation. It's never been the like lack of potential for Kyle Pitts. It's always been production.
Absolutely. And I think that for me, the non like caring part of it, maybe, and that's just me. I'm not, saying that, Kyle is, hey man, this dude is super lazy. I'm not saying anything like that, but it just, based off of what I see on film, it seems like he's kind of out of it, from time to time. And I think that, when you have a guy like Kirk Cousins in the fold, there were some moments, when Kirk was healthy and he was getting and Kyle was finding his way from a production standpoint. But like, obviously that started to fall off when Kirk we found out that he was hurt. you know, but I think overall this is something to pay attention to, and I think that if they're going to do it, draft night would make sense because you don't have a third round pick, and there's the thing going around the league, like Free said, there are a lot of tight ends that have become available, but before then, there were some conversations about essentially Kyle being available for a third round pick, and that makes a lot of sense for the Falcons if they want to be able to take advantage of the defensive talent that's on the top end of this draft. So I think it's something definitely to keep an eye on, and we will definitely keep an eye on it right here on the Atlanta Football Party. But coming up next, the Bengals and Trey Hendrickson are at a standstill about money. Shocking, right? We're going to discuss if Terry needs to make one last pitch to make it happen. We'll talk about it next. But first, I'll let you know that this episode of the Atlanta Football Party is brought to you by FanDuel. March Madness is here, people. Yes, it's March 24th to be exact. And FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. This is an amazing opportunity. You need to do it right now because FanDuel got some great stuff over there waiting just for you right now. New customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's 200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. Did you get a chance to see Derek Queen drop that buzzer beater in? Oh my gosh, you need to get in on the action, man. Get some money off that stuff. Not only be excited about it, but go get you some money. So, I got my eye on a few underdogs this year, and FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. You got to do it right now. The app is super simple to use. And when I win, I get paid instantly. No waiting around. So I've always been a guy to give me my money. That's what I'm all about, baby. So go to FanDuel.com right now and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. I want to say thank you for making the Atlanta Football Party your first listen today. Why don't you go ahead and check out my main man, Aaron Freeman, on Locked On Falcons? Because he's the man. He's the Falcons prophet. It's been proven. So you don't have to have faith, because it's there. There you go. See, what I'm saying? I'm going to start preaching to y'all one of these days. We'll get there. We'll get there eventually. T, don't laugh at me like that. Come on.
It was so funny.
But Trey Hendrickson, was allowed to go seek a trade, and see what's out there, test the market. We talk about Kyle Pitts, testing the market. What's his market value? The Bengals said, Trey Hendrickson, go try that thing on out. And then it got a little quiet for a little bit. And then the Bengals came out after they dropped the bag for their top two wide receivers and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. They said, hey, Trey, we want to get you. Hey, man, come on. Let's figure it out. Now, Trey said that, according to ESPN, that he's willing to sit out the whole year. And for me, I feel like this is a ploy to kind of speed up this process. Essentially, I feel like Trey Hendrickson's camp is saying, either you're going to tinkle or get off the pot. And if there's a standstill right there and they don't want to tinkle with the type of money that it's going to take to bring that man in, I honestly believe that, hey, 3 years, $105 million, that'll get the deal done. That's, hey, you going to 33 years old? Okay, whatever. You figure it out. But I think that this is an opportunity for Terry Fontenot to kind of go and jump in there. Free. Do you feel like this is an opportunity, or this is just Terry Hendrickson camp just trying to speed up the process so the Bengals can go pay him his bread?
Well, I think, the good thing if you're in Trey Hendrickson's camp is that the Bengals have been very public with their desire to retain him, which, and give him an extension, which in previous years when he has asked for an extension, they've been like, think about it, And so like now you have this potential leverage where it's like, you want me here. And so now I will sort of threaten by withholding my services. And so that will, hopefully force your hand to give me what I want. And so I do think this Trey Hendrickson thing I think the immediate reaction from a lot of folks after they signed Higgins and Chase was, oh, they're going to get a deal done with Trey Hendrickson because they were able to get a deal done with Higgins and Chase. And it was like, I'm not convinced of that, right? Just because I felt like the whole time,
Yeah.
You kind of knew that they were going to get a deal done with Higgins and Chase, but like that's been the Trey Hendrickson saga, where it's just like, are they going to get a deal done with him? Are they going to be able to move him? The price tag went up. He was asking for 30, then Myles Garrett got 40, and it's like, okay, well, give me. I had more sacks than that guy. Like, give me more. So I do feel like, to answer your question, Jarvis, I do feel like there is an opportunity for a team, including the Atlanta Falcons, to sort of swoop in to make Trey Hendrickson whole, because I don't know if the Bengals are going to be able to do the thing that they want to do and what Trey Hendrickson wants to do. Trey Hendrickson has stated many times that he wants to stay in Cincinnati. Cincinnati has said many times that they want to keep him there, but ultimately, money talks. And so at some point, someone's money will do all the talking, and Trey Hendrickson will be playing for that football team. And maybe that's the Atlanta Falcons.
Yeah, I understand this kind of situation, right? Like, you're trying to pull out every stop to say, hey man, give me my money. I want to get my money situated. So I need new money. Exactly. Because $16 million left on his contract this year. And then obviously he wants to be able to add a couple of years on and in that $35 million range and try and make it work out. So I think this is a prime opportunity for Terry to say, okay, here's what I'm willing to offer. Let's start having some conversations and see where we can go with this. Because I honestly believe that, given how free agency played out, it was a lot of filler guys. I mean, no offense to Leonard Floyd and Jordan Fuller and all those guys. No offense to them whatsoever. Don't come at me on social media. You know what I'm saying? Because I know Free was very distraught when Big Boy came at him that day on Twitter. He was a little, he was a little shaken up a little bit. But hey, I had to comfort my boy, and we were all good, baby. But yeah, but seriously though, I think this is an opportunity, because everybody understands where the Bengals are. They are a team that traditionally they don't pay their guys, and it's obvious what they value. And I've talked about this when it comes to Terry Fontenot and going best player available and all those guys being on offense. Like, you can't sit up here and tell me that all the best player available when you were picking were on the opposite side of the football. So that's what you value, right? So you pay what you value. So they paid Higgins and Chase. They value keeping Joe Burrow happy, so he won't try to get out there like Carson Palmer did. So it seems like, given how this situation is playing out, there is an opportunity there. So Tori, what say you? Are you in the camp of, this is just Trey using whatever tool he has to try to stick around in Cincinnati? Or is this an opportunity saying for Terry Fontenot to kind of hop in and say, hey, let's have a conversation?
I think I'll come at this from the viewpoint of the Falcons, where I think the Falcons have the capabilities towards the cap in next year and the year after next, that they could potentially sign somebody to a massive deal, and it not be super detrimental. Once you're out of the Kirk Cousins-ness of everything, you're actually in a really good spot towards the cap in 2026 and 27. You have to make some other decisions about some big time contracts, but you cross that bridge, I think, when you get there. Sure. The problem for me, and I think where the Falcons are right now, is, can they make it work this year? Like, can you get Trey Hendrickson on the roster this year based on what you have in terms of draft capital and in terms of any space you have towards the cap? And that's where I think the issue lies. If I'm looking at this from like a business decision standpoint, like, of course, Trey Hendrickson is Trey Hendrickson. If you're the Falcons and in need of some pass rush help, that's somebody who is going to theoretically make your pass rush better. Sure. He has shown he has the ability to do that. But the problem is like, what are the Falcons having to give up in 2025 in order to get him on the roster? Like, can they even do that? Like, can they even package something together to get him here? That's the issue that I see. It's not necessarily about like a want to. Of course, you would want someone like Trey Hendrickson on your roster, but at the exact same time, it's like, can you make an offer that Trey Hendrickson likes? Can you make an offer that the Bengals like? Like, and I don't know if the Falcons could do that right now. Unfortunately, if I'm being a bit realistic, if this is next year, heck, I feel completely different. If it's 2027, I feel completely different, though Trey Hendrickson is, growing older, as we all are, unfortunately.
Yes.
But I think like this year, it's really difficult for me to see a way to Trey Hendrickson on the roster.
Yeah. And I'm glad you bring up the whole salary cap piece, because I think that's very important, right? And I always talked about how coaches think right now on the roster as far as trying to get wins and all that stuff. And I think general managers have to think about the future. So that's why I always like how you have to separate those guys, because it's two totally different mindsets. Because coaches have to prove that, hey, I'm a good coach and I can win football games right now. And general managers have to say, hey, I have to think about it right now, but I have to think about the future as well, as far as being able to construct a roster that can be a consistent contender on a year in and year out basis. So for me, I think Terry, he might be in a situation where he might have to take his general manager hat off and look at it from a standpoint of, okay, how can I get this guy on this roster? Because I know that next season, I'll be good to go as far as money goes. But it's just a matter of, do I trade my second round pick and only have 2 picks in the top half of the draft?
Especially knowing how many holes you have to fill. Like,
Exactly.
that's another thing. Like,
Yeah.
That's my biggest thing, is like, you have so many holes to fill and you have so many things, especially defensively, that you have to kind of like come to terms with. And you're trying to make this team better than what it was in 2024. And right. I think at this point in time, it's like, is this roster to the point where we feel confident in saying that? I don't know if you can feel confident in saying that. Now, if you go out and get Trey Hendrickson, like, you feel pretty confident that you're moving in the right direction and you have a playmaker. But the opportunity cost versus the opportunity lost of it all, like, I hate being kind of like the bearer of bad news, but it's like, sure, the Falcons have to be you have to be strategic. That's what the name of the game is. And like, you need a corner, you need a nickel, you need a safety, you need probably a bit more at linebacker, you definitely need all you can get in the front seven. So, like, is making this one move to get Trey Hendrickson going to fix everything about this defense that needs to be fixed?
Ooh, that is an amazing question. And I think the answer to that is no. As good as he is, I think the answer to that is no. And this is pure speculation, right? Coming up next, though, we're going to talk about what Terry Fontenot's vision is, and can we see it? And is it clear and concise to get where they need to be? Guys, Jarvis Davis here, host of the Atlanta Football Party. Tanisha will be back. Please, y'all, don't start sending me messages and DMs and saying, where's Tanisha? I miss her dearly. Yeah, we miss her too. She'll be back on Thursday. And also we have Tori McElhaney of AtlantaFalcons.com. I was looking for a mock draft, Tori. I was searching. I was trying to find one to see if you had dropped another one. So, when do they actually drop?
Every Thursday, Jarvis. I drop a new one every Thursday. I took a corner in this past one, and I was like, oh man, people are gonna be so excited.
No doubt. Make sure you all check that out over at AtlantaFalcons.com. But as we were talking about, potentially going after Trey Hendrickson and how that would be very difficult in 2025, but you might be able to make something work in 2026. But I know that a lot of fans weren't too happy about the free agency. and what they came about. The first wave of it, right? You still sign people, but most of the free agency work has been done, and teams are moving on to the draft and trying to figure out what's going on that end. But we have to understand the situation that the Falcons are in financially, and understanding that where the Falcons are financially, the moves that they've made, what they have and what they don't have going into this year's draft. Do you understand Terry Fontenot's vision? And do you see it to where, hey, the Falcons might be onto something?
The second question is a difficult question to answer. I understand Terry Fontenot's vision. I think Tori touched upon it earlier when talking about the Trey Hendrickson thing, where it feels like the Falcons are essentially doing what they did in 2022 when they traded Matt Ryan and took a $40 million dead money hit on that. And they're essentially doing the same thing now with Kirk Cousins as they look to trade Kirk Cousins and potentially take a $37 million dead money hit on that, potentially all this year or spread out over multiple years, depending on when they trade Kirk Cousins between, now in June or after June at this point, with the idea of we're going to kind of take it easy, right? And you saw in that 2022 offseason that the Falcons didn't make any big splashes. They signed a bunch of players, but a lot of sort of cheap free agents, Lorenzo Carter, Rashaan Evans, Dean Marlowe, a whole bunch of guys that were just kind of stopgaps to get them through that season before they had a big windfall of cash in 2023. And then we saw them spend that money in order to make the big moves. And I think that's the vision here, that the Falcons are just kind of, we're going to get some stopgaps, some 1 year sort of cheap guys. We'll get through this season. We'll get a bunch of cash to be able to spend in 2026. And that's when we'll really make our push forward. And in the meantime, we get a year to evaluate Michael Penix. I think that's the vision that they have. I see it. I get it. Like, it makes sense. Like, but at the same time, it's like, I don't know if, like, do you have the same sort of leeway that I think Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot had in 2022 now that we're in 2025? And I think that's really where I think the vision becomes a little bit sketchier, a little blurrier, because you're sitting there going like, then you were coming off of year one of Arthur Smith and you had a lot of goodwill towards that regime. Okay, we're going to have to rebuild this thing and readjust and all this stuff. And it's like, the future is looking great. And now 3 years later, you haven't had a winning season yet. And it's like, you don't have that same sort of optimism, I think, at this point in time, that it's all going to be hunky-dory and it's all going to work out like you did have it 3 years ago. And so I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for this vision, that if they don't get the results on the football field, there's going to be conversations about whether or not they should be the people running the vision in 2026, or whether that will be another GM, another head coach, or whatever. And so I think that's where I think the vision gets a little bit blurry. I see it, but at the same time, it's like, we'll see how it works out. That's really the big question right now.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point about like context too, about like where the organization was in like 21 and 22 versus where it is now going into 25. And I actually said this on our own podcast network not too long ago about how I think if the Falcons would have matched or exceeded the expectations that the team had for itself in 2024, it makes you feel differently about where it is in 2025. I think the fact that the Falcons did not have a productive winning season, coupled with the fact that they did not get a berth to the playoffs, were not NFC South champions, despite starting the year where they were in terms of the NFC South race, I think that completely changes your viewpoint of what the 2025 offseason is. Because I think we always knew, based on the moves that they made in the last 2 years, that the 2025 offseason was going to be a bit quiet. And based on kind of how much money they would have, knowing that they sent a 3rd round pick to the Patriots to get Matthew Judon, like there were so many things that you knew going into. But if the Falcons were winning, if they were NFC South champions, if they were playing in the playoffs, like you take that and you're like, yeah, because they built a really good roster that won X amount of games, double-digit amount of games. Like, you're okay with that. But the fact that they didn't do that in 2024, I think makes, especially for the fan base, like this offseason, a tough pill to swallow. And the vision becomes murkier because to this point, everything that you did in 21, 22, 23 to build a winning roster didn't happen. This roster in 2024 didn't win the amount of games that they needed to in order to be playoff contenders. And that's the reality of the situation. And so the context surrounding that changes how you feel about 2025.
Yeah, it's so, because I think we talked about this on one of our recent podcasts. We were discussing how the biggest story in this offseason, going into this offseason, is what they're going to do with Kirk Cousins. It is so hard for me to see your vision if you cleaning up previous mess, right? Like Free mentioned, you had to clean up the mess in 2022 and bringing in Jags, essentially guys who are just filling a roster spot and hoping you get production, some type of production on a 1-year deal guy, right? So I think that's what makes it a little bit murky for me to be able to, because we're not talking about, okay, can this guy that you bring in as a free agent be the guy to help you get to the type of defense that you want to have, which is pairing with an offense that is built to score 28 points a game, right? And carry your team. Can you sustain the lead by teams who are going to be forced to pass the ball more? And you're going to be able, can you get to the quarterback and put them on the ground and start to force turnovers to grow that even wider margin so you can put them away in the fourth quarters? Because Falcons had an issue with that. And we know why. Because they can't get to the quarterback consistently and sustain those leads. So I think that, if you're cleaning up previous mess, it's hard for me to see your vision. And that's why I feel like it's a little too murky for me. But Free, when you think about that murkiness, and given what the moves or non-moves that they made in free agency, well, let me scratch that. So let me ask you this. I feel like, throw a little audible here at you guys. I feel like people have forgotten about Braylon Trice and what he brings to the table and where the Falcons drafted him as a third-round pick last year in previous drafts, and they aren't accounting for him going into the 2025 season. So, Free, I want to get your thoughts, and T, you can jump in as well. What is your expectation for him, and as far as coming into this season and giving the dire need that they need for someone to be able to pop out and say, hey, man, I need to show y'all what time it is when it comes to getting to the quarterback? Do you feel like is Trice in that scenario for you?
Well, for me, not particularly, but I think some of that is owed to I just wasn't as high on Braylon Trice's upside and potential in the ceiling in the NFL when we drafted him. Like, I saw him more as like a rotational piece, sure, more like a Brooks Reed type of player than necessarily a guy that was going to be a true difference maker on your defense.
Yeah.
And so like that's a guy that can, give you valuable snaps against the run. That's a guy that can get after the quarterback if need be, but like that's not your main guy, right? Mm-hmm. If that's the 6th or 7th guy in your rotation, you probably are doing good. If that's like the 3rd or 4th guy in your rotation, that's not necessarily a guy that is going to move the needle in that regard. And so that was my thoughts prior to the injury. And then coming off the ACL injury, where you miss that year of development that is so necessary for some of these young pass rushers, like my expectations aren't increased, right? I'm not going to say that they're lower, but it's just one of those things where it's even going to be even harder to reach the level I previously thought you were going to get to. And that level wasn't particularly high. So for me with Braylon Trice, I look at him as, I think he can be a contributor for this football team, but I don't know if the Falcons are counting on Braylon Trice to be a difference maker for them. I don't know if that's a bet that I would be willing to make, but obviously other people's mileage may vary.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as Free, where it's like, I understood the pick, and I knew that the Falcons were really happy to get Braylon Trice when they did last season. And I think that having seen what he was able to do every day in training camp and in those before the injury during the Miami joint practices. I thought he was kind of the star of the show for those joint practices. But that's kind of all I have to go off of. And it's really hard to kind of sit here and be like, yeah, the Falcons are going to fix their pass rush because Braylon Trice is healthy again. Like, that to me is a gamble to say that this one guy is going to be a huge difference maker for this team when I don't really know what they have in Braylon Trice. I don't know the type of caliber of player that's going to come onto the scene in OTAs and mini camps and, you know, into the season because we haven't seen him. In all honesty, like he and you know, you hope that you get a bang for your buck with him. You know, you hope that the first year setback of a knee injury that kept him off the field for a year, like won't be a detriment to his progress. But I can't say that right now. I have not seen him. And I know the Falcons have said, you know, whether it be Raheem Morris or Terry Fontenot, like they feel really confident in who Braylon Trice is and what he can provide this team. But I kind of agree with Free. It's like, are you expecting a guy who you drafted last year, who's coming off of a season-ending knee injury, to come in and be the guy in 2025? Like, I don't think that's particularly fair Braylon Trice either. Like, I think like putting that moniker and putting that expectation on him, whether it be the Falcons doing so or the fan base doing so, is not indicative of kind of where he is in his overall career and development. I feel like that's incredibly unfair to kind of be like, Braylon Trice, go out there and get 8 sacks this year, be our like breadwinner, be our guy, like affect the quarterback every single snap. Like, that's not realistic to me based on who Braylon Trice is and what I thought his expectation was in this lineup and in this rotation and what's transpired in the year since they've drafted him. I think that Braylon Trice has a good upside. I think he has a high ceiling, but I don't know where the floor is. Like, I can't tell you where the floor or ceiling is for Braylon Trice right now. So setting any type of expectation and foundation for Braylon Trice at this point in time, when we haven't seen him in over a year and we haven't actually longer than that, we haven't seen him in the professional game. We haven't seen him outside of the college ranks. Like, we do not know what type of player he is. And so to kind of set an expectation for him is just like, I'm not ready to do that.
Yeah, it definitely would be unfair. I agree with you on that. And for me, I really liked what I saw from Braylon coming out of UW. You know, I like he's a disruptive guy, and it's funny that you use Brooks Reed as a comp, even though that doesn't excite me for you. But you know, for what Brooks Reed wasn't able to do, you know, and get into the pass rush, get into the passer on a consistent basis, but he was a disruptive type guy. And the Falcons need that too, right? Like, they need people to cause havoc. They need people to pay attention to your number when they're getting ready for you on Sundays, right? I feel like the guy that we're going to talk about a little bit later on, in Grady Jarrett, he was that guy that you circled. Who are they going to circle now? You know? So, you know, for Braylon Trice, I think that he has to kind of be forgotten about as far as just from a who can be our guy to that we can count on to rush the passer on 3rd and long on a consistent basis, especially if I'm Terry Fontenot, because we talked about on a consistent basis that this man has to do well. He has to hit it out of the park. Now that we got to do free agency and we're going into this draft, he has to figure out a way to try to get some more draft picks or draft pick, you know, and get some guys in here that can potentially be one of those guys and let them rise to the top. Like, throw a whole bunch of guys out there that you know have potential and see who rises. It could be Arnold Ebiketie, probably. More than likely, I don't know, but it can be because you need guys to come in, be productive for you in that realm. But speaking of production in the NFL draft, the Falcons had a couple of guys come in for visits. We're going to talk about whether or not that is the direction that they're headed when it comes to who they will draft in the first round with that 15th overall pick.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the bracket breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
It is the Atlanta Football Party. I'm your host, Jarvis Davis. I have sitting with me Tori McElhaney and my main man, Aaron Freeman. Tori of AtlantaFalcons.com and Aaron Freeman of Locked On Falcons. If you don't listen or read or subscribe to the Locked On Falcons or check out AtlantaFalcons.com, you're missing out on life and you need to get your stuff together, sir or ma'am. Yes. So, but here we have the Atlanta Falcons. They're doing the visits, and I came across a couple of names that were kind of interesting. Nick Emanwari, safety out of South Carolina, and Maxwell Harrison, the cornerback out of Kentucky. Found out that, hey, those guys have visits or will be visiting with the Atlanta Falcons leading up to the draft. My question to you, Tori, are the Falcons tipping their hand a little bit with bringing these guys in? Are they just doing their due diligence? Or this is something that, hey, this could be a real possibility that they take someone to shore up the back end of their defense?
I mean, I drafted a cornerback in my mock draft this past week. I mean,
start now. Don't start it.
No, in all seriousness, I think that I'm really curious because those are the type of guys that I think a lot of draft experts at this point in time have in the like mid 20s to the 32nd pick of the draft. So if the Falcons are wanting to kind of play ball a little bit and move out of number 15, those are the type of guys that I think are more likely to fall into the back half or the back quartile of the first round. So if we're like reading tea leaves, like that's kind of the tea leaves that I am kind of looking at. But it's also very early on in the process, and you have a bunch of guys who you can bring in to the building. I think that, like, yes, it's a part of like due diligence, and yes, it's that kind of stuff. And sure, we can kind of play around with the idea of the Falcons moving out of number 15 into like 20 to 30 to maybe get one of those guys. But for the most part, I think that this is a part of the process. Like, you get 33 of these visits, however many it is now. Like, there's always options as to who you can bring in. I don't think just because they bring in, these two guys specifically, that means that they're tipping their hand and going to draft these guys. I think that if anything, it's a part of the process.
Yeah, I like the idea of what you said. You said that, hey, those guys are guys that are being looked at towards the end of the first round. Hey, what did the general manager say at the end of the year press conference? Hey, man, we might trade down. We out here. You know what I'm saying? We outside. My phone on right now. I paid my bill. Give me a call. If there's and I think the most important thing for that to happen for the Falcons, in order for that to happen, is that there has to be a run on a position. And we know if there's a run on quarterbacks, oh my gosh, what if Jackson Dart goes in the top 10? Like that, it could happen. It's possible. We've seen guys go a lot higher than what they normally go, or you would have him go if it was normal situations, right? Quarterback thirsty teams are just different. And if you have a team that is just, oh my gosh, I can't believe Jackson Dart, went this high, or what are we gonna do? Or that we had our eye on him at 23 or whatever, or at 35 or 37 in the second round. And I think that will be the ideal scenario for the Falcons, because their phone will ring if that were something like that were to happen. So for you, Free, is it a matter of the Falcons just doing their due diligence, or are you in a space where, hey, the Falcons are preparing to move back because they gotten a good idea as to how that board is going to fall on at the end of April?
I think it's all of the above, Jarvis. I feel like when like the thing that people forget about the pre-draft process is like at the end of the season from January to April, you're just collecting information on these players. Like that's really what this is about.
Sure.
And I think it's interesting with these two specific players in Nicky Manwari and Maxwell Harrison. I haven't done a deep dive on Harrison's film, but I've talked to a lot of people that have watched his film, and they weren't that impressed with him. Like, you know, in the sense of like, he's a good prospect, day two sort of guy, but like
4.28, all that stuff. Yeah.
But that's the thing was, it's like, I think a lot of people I've talked to were like, I didn't see 4.28 speed on the field. And then he runs a 4.28 at the combine. And it's like, okay, that's weird. And then Nicky Manwari, you could watch this film and see he's a good athlete, but like this sort of like best athlete at the safety position ever type of player, like that didn't necessarily immediately jump off the film. And so I think these two players specifically is just like, basically what I'm saying is like, does the film match up the athletic profile? And so I think that type of player probably requires a deeper dive than necessarily somebody that you just watch the film. You're like, yep, I see what that guy is. I know exactly what that guy is. And so you bring players like Nicky Manwari and Maxwell Harrison into your building just to kind of trying to figure out what you're all about. Like, what is this? Is it the athlete that we need to bet on? And that's the high upside player, or is it the film that's really the tell sign of what you're going to be at the next level, which is probably a good player and a starter, but may not necessarily be that sort of elite, you know, whatever. And so I do feel like that probably falls in like the due diligence of just like, we're just trying to figure out who these two specific guys are, rather than just like, this is tipping our hand to what our draft plans are. But I certainly think the more information you collect about these players, as Tori's talking about, like in a world where you do move back in the draft and the edge rushers that you were potentially targeting there, because of course we know with 100% certainty that the Atlanta Falcons are taking an edge rusher in the first round.
100% fact, sir.
100%. You know, it's just this is really just a hypothetical that we're talking about, where the Falcons would not take a pass rusher, right? You know, Tori is just going through the exercise of just like making these mock drafts where they're definitely not taking, you know, so it's
going through the motions by putting the cornerback at 15.
You
have to write a certain number of words, and cornerback is one of those words that she has to write. That's basically it. You know, I do feel like it does make sense for the Falcons to do their homework on some of the guys that they might have to quote unquote settle on in a purely hypothetical, where they do not take a pass rusher at 15 and potentially move back 5-10 spots or whatever, just to sort of see, so that, you know, someone comes away and blows you with an offer that you're not expecting. You're like, okay, well, they're trading us a future first round pick to move up 5 spots or something ridiculous. And like, this is an offer we can't refuse. And all of a sudden that throws a wrench into your plan. You have to have all these plans and contingencies for draft day. And that's what this process is about. So it's due diligence. It's doing your homework on these guys. And there's probably legit interest, because if you weren't interested in drafting these guys, you know, why waste the jet fuel? Well, you know, and the rental cars and whatnot. So yeah, so I think it's all of the above.
And the buckets of ice and bananas, you know, you don't need to waste that stuff. Yeah, man. You know, that stuff costs. All right, coming up next, we will ask a very interesting question that I want to get Tori and Aaron's answer. We'll talk about it next. Wrapping things up right here on the Atlanta Football Party. I know Grady Jarrett has gone on to sign with the Chicago Bears, but I wanted to get Tori's thoughts on Grady Jarrett going to sign with another team. The Falcons releasing him first, and then Grady Jarrett going to another team, and what that means to this organization, Tori, and what he meant to this organization. What are your thoughts on that? Because I want to get your thoughts on that, because you didn't get a chance to chime in when we actually discussed when it first happened.
Yeah, I think it was a sad day for the organization to part ways with Grady Jarrett. And I think that it it's been reported that the Falcons did make an offer to keep him in Atlanta. It was not an offer that Grady or his camp was willing to play ball with. They thought that his market was more robust, and turned out it was. Like, the Bears gave him a pretty solid offer. And I think one that is warranted for someone like Grady Jarrett, even coming off of a 2-year period where, he only plays in 8 games. 2 years ago, that the production really isn't there this past year, but what Grady Jarrett is to an organization, and especially for a unit, cannot be overlooked or minimized. I think that the impact that Grady Jarrett had for a decade in Atlanta, I said this on our own podcast, I think, like right when it happened, when we were kind of breaking down the move. Overall, I don't think that this is the end of Grady Jarrett's impact in Atlanta. I don't think this is the end of Grady Jarrett's connection with the Atlanta Falcons organization. I think if anything, it's just a pause and to give him the opportunity to do something a little bit different to end his career. Because realistically, you look at his age, he's a D tackle. And I think to a certain point, it's going to all catch up with us. And so I think for Grady Jarrett to have kind of this refresh and a new experience is good for him. I think for the Falcons, it now changes the way that I look at this defense and the leadership aspect of this defense. I think you're looking a lot more to Jesse Bates. I think you're looking a lot more to AJ Terrell, but those guys are on the back end. How do you everything that Grady Jarrett was to this defense, but particularly this defensive front, to the point of what you were saying earlier, I've made this point time and time again over years of covering this team. Every single offensive coordinator knew where 97 was on the field at all times.
Yep.
Who is that guy moving forward that you look at across and you're like, we need to account for him. We need to know where he is at all times. Who is that guy for this defensive front at this point in time? Don't know. I don't know yet. And, you hope somebody materializes, and you hope that there is kind of that evolution in somebody's game. But at this point in time, it's like not having Grady Jarrett anchor this defense is a new era of Falcons football that we have not seen in a decade. And it's going to be interesting to see where things go. But I think it's also appropriate to say that it was a bit sad. It was a bit sad to know that Grady Jarrett, the next time we see Grady Jarrett, will not be in a Falcons uniform. It will not be in Atlanta. It's just kind of weird. It's weird. I feel the same way that I felt the day that the Falcons sent Matt Ryan to Indianapolis. Very, very similar feelings.
Absolutely. And I think Tori kind of touched on it, so I asked you this question. First, I want to read to this quote from Grady Jarrett's goodbye on IG that he sent a message to the Falcons fans. As I continue to transition to this next thing for me, due to some unforeseen business decisions we all know that we signed up for. Unfortunately, I didn't see it coming at this point. Not that I'm looking to place blame here, Free, but could you see this as a mutually beneficial decision that was made here?
Well, as a lifelong Falcons skeptic, I'm skeptical of whether it's going to be mutually beneficial to the Falcons. Obviously, I think Grady Jarrett getting the bag and playing for the Bears and playing for a defensive line, as Tori mentioned, where he's not going to be circled as that guy, right? Where Montez Sweat is going to be that guy. And they just got a lot of money for Deo Odeyingbo, and they have a top 10 pick, and they could take another pass rusher that high. And so he gets kind of the help in Chicago that he never really got in Atlanta outside of 2023 when the Falcons brought in all those veteran players. And then unfortunately that was the 1 year that Grady Jarrett didn't get the finish because he got injured halfway through the season. So the clear benefit for Grady Jarrett going to Chicago and departing Atlanta, I think it's there. As Tori said, the question is, will the Falcons benefit from this? And it's really going to depend on the void that now Grady Jarrett his absence has created. As Tori said, someone has to step in and fill that void, right? And right now, your most proven option on the interior D line is David Onyemata, but he's probably not a long-term option here. And frankly, if he's the guy, if he's the go-to guy, that's kind of not going to say a fail for the Falcons, but that's going to be a little disappointing for the Falcons because I think they're clearly, as Tori's indicating, hoping like a Rukaroro or Brandon Dorless or somebody else steps into that sort of void to become the next Grady Jarrett that can be the guy that defensive or offensive coordinators are circling and be like, you got to keep an eye on this guy. So I think it remains to be seen if it's beneficial for the Falcons. The path is there. If one of these young players does step up and we're like, oh man, like this guy's on the verge of being the next Grady Jarrett, then we'll sit here and be like, but that was only made available because of the departure of Grady Jarrett. Like you needed to not have Grady Jarrett to appreciate, the next guy in that sort of lineage or whatnot. So it could be beneficial for the Falcons, but as we sit here today, like you got to squint to sort of see it at this point in time. And, it may be a little clearer 6 months ago.
The measuring stick.
Yeah. When we get to the games and we're like, oh, okay, this is what we're talking. Oh,
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Like that's, but like right now it's just like, yeah, okay, we'll see. We'll see what happens. That's basically what it is at.
And I think that, Grady laid it out about this whole business aspect. I think from a business aspect, yes, it was beneficial for the Falcons because they saw that $16 million and said, hey, that's too juicy for us to pass up. I know putting it like that shouldn't be that simple for a guy like Grady Jarrett and what he brought to this organization, but they had to make a financial decision, and I thought that they weren't going to make that one. I thought they would have gone with a guy like David Onyemata and said, hey, man, bro, sorry, but we got to move on. And they were like, nah, we got to go and talk to Mr. Jarrett. And I'm glad you brought that report up, Tori. Hey, they did try to make an offer, and Todd France ain't having that. I'm sorry. Because the way he answered that question when he came out about, he said Grady Jarrett is a Falcon for now. I was like, oh, I know what time it is there. Yeah, super agents don't play around like that. They understand the market and they understand what those guys bring to the table, what their guys bring to the table. And I think that it was inevitable. I was not shocked at all that Grady Jarrett pretty much had a deal ready to roll as soon as the Falcons let him go. So we would definitely keep an eye on as to the long-term benefit for cutting Grady Jarrett. That remains to be seen. And Lord, Terry better hope Rook plays well this year. That's all I got to say. I'm going to thank you for making the Atlanta Football Party your first listen today. Why don't you go ahead and check out my main man, Aaron Freeman of Locked On Falcons. His podcast is free and available wherever you download your podcast. And wherever you download your podcast, make sure you leave him a 5-star review. Leave Locked On Sports Atlanta a 5-star review. And leave the podcast network that Tori works for. What's it called, T?
The Atlanta Falcons Podcast Network.
There we go. The Atlanta Falcons Podcast Network, which is, I should have known that. It's pretty simple.
Pretty self-explanatory.
It's self-explanatory, So yeah. I'm going to get out of here before I make myself sound a little bit more slow today. So we'll see y'all on Thursday where Tanisha will be back, and y'all don't have to worry about the substitute teacher holding it down anymore.